Thank you all. It's a great pleasure for us to commence the second installment of our Arab Uprisings inaugural event here. This is the second installment, and we're very fortunate to have such a terrific group of scholars with us. We brought these panels together, trying, with the goal of asking the brightest minds out there what they thought about the Arab uprisings 10 years later. And we tasked the participants with two questions. The first is, what are the politics of marking the Arab uprisings? The second, what aspects of the uprisings do you find most interesting, revealing, and or enduring? Which might be missing or given short shrift in the literature and beyond. And so we ask our colleagues today to sort of chime in with their insights and thoughts on the Arab uprising. We have a spectacular list of participants today, and I will quickly introduce them so then we can move on to each of their presentations. My colleagues, Bassam Haddad, Associate Professor at the School for Policy and Government at George Mason University. Sherene Seikaly is Associate Professor of History at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Rabab Al-Mahdi is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the American University in Cairo. I believe it's not, you are Professor of Political Science. Muriam Haleh-Davis is an Assistant Professor of History at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Mohammed Bamyeh is Professor of Sociology and Religious Studies at University of Pittsburgh. Nadje Al-Ali is Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Center for Middle East Studies at Brown University. Wedeen is Professor of Political Science and the Co-Director of the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory at the University of Chicago. And Amr Adly is Assistant Professor in the Department of Political Science at the American University of Cairo. Welcome, everyone. And with no further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Bassam Haddad. Bassam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Amaney, and thanks to everyone for joining. I was actually moderating the first event or the first panel, and I was a bit harsh on the timing, so I do expect you to be harsh. I'm going to start in just a second. I just want to say that a lot has been covered. People can go back to the first panel and click on it and listen. I will actually adjust my comments per what has been covered more or less, so bear with me. And second, I will try to read some of my comments in order to keep the time, given that I need to abide by the same rules. So I'm starting right now, Amaney. Thank you, Amaney, for being my co-conspirator and the engine behind this project as well. So help me God. I'm bimzah. All right, so the politics of marking the uprisings in whole and in parts with an S is indeed a controversial affair. Seems less controversial, but it actually is. It might seem evident that the way one views or conceptualizes the uprisings depends on one's position towards the debate's fault lines, as well as on one's knowledge of the region's intricacies, not just then, but also historically and ongoing. For casual observers, the uprisings took a sharp turn to mayhem long ago, and that's how they view it and they move on. For cynical observers who tend to discount the democratic tendencies of peoples of the region, the anti-authoritarian rule uprisings and so on, because they're not just against authoritarian rule, as I will suggest, in the Arab world, were always an anomaly that was confirmed by consequences. And these are the cynical observers. For idealists or various brands of idealists, the uprisings were the true expression of the quest for freedom and dignity that must prevail even in the short to medium run. And hence the disappointment in this case. Yet for those who take the long view, the uprisings are not an entirely new phenomenon, but a continuation of politics and of the politics of upheaval in particular, one that rears its head at successive junctures historically to demand justice, equality, dignity, freedom. It is also not a bounded affair, the uprisings that is, with discrete results that we can summarily assess. I hold this latter longue durée view and insist on the ongoing nature of protest that we do not see if they don't pop up on mainstream media, or many of us do not see if they don't pop up on mainstream media and mainstream literature. But they are always ongoing against the views that say, how come the people in the region are not rising up? People were saying this in the 80s, in the 90s, in the 2000s, as if they actually were not. And that is untrue, of course. The reality is that the uprisings ultimately, reality is that the uprisings are more complex than a lot of these views that I shared, less conclusive, and most importantly, not over, as we witnessed during the past 2 years with continuous mass protests erupting in at least four more countries in the region and the Arab world. But that does not mean one cannot begin to take stock. Surely it's better. It's a better vantage point than 2012, when we witnessed a deluge of knowledge production, including actual books published in 2012 on the Arab uprisings, or the Arab Spring, which is a term that I don't use, as though it was somewhat of a done deal. Nonetheless, marking the politics of the uprisings is an important exercise, not least for those who continue to have a visceral stake in the outcome, whose bodies, lives, and prospects are still hijacked by an unknown future, driven by some of the same social forces and their regional and external backers who underwrote their oppression or repression and disenfranchisement. This is partly why we are holding this discussion. And I personally look forward to learning more from my co-panelists, as I did in the first panel that I moderated, from the multitude of perspectives that will be aired and that I have already heard, that by no means, by the way, exhaust the landscape. So we are a distinct pool. There are other pools and other viewpoints that are worth considering, of course. Looking back to the uprisings, we witness a basic schism between those who always preferred the status quo regimes and those who wished to topple them. But these debates, which actually still take place, and we sometimes dismiss them because it's it's kind of abominable to think about those who just want to support the existing regimes that ruled for decades in various exploitative ways. But these debates ultimately are obvious and uninteresting, even if they exist and we need to pay attention to them. In fact, they seldom take place in serious settings. The more intense and productive debates often take place among those who prefer and affirm the need for an alternative to the status quo. The questions become how to do it, who is the emerging alternative, and who would be involved in the process. And perhaps equally important is the question of what is being protested. There is an excess of arguments that this is a protest against dictatorship, authoritarian rule, and repression, political repression, and not enough recognition that other political economic factors have indeed been just as significant, if not more so, in various settings. And of course, they all combine to address the question of dignity. But this is not what we're addressing at this point. The sort of combination of things that produced the impetus for the protests. Thus, my comments will sidestep the pessimistic views of failure, which we witness all around us in various commentaries. It is more productive to focus instead on the gains that were made in terms of the empowerment of social groups and forces interested in social justice for all, because there are groups that are interested in social justice, but not necessarily for all, and they have their own ways of exclusion, of what they can call legitimate exclusion. In this regard, the picture is mixed, punctuated with several failures on the macro and holistic levels, because we did not have exactly what people wanted. But that's not something that should be considered an end. There is no end to these protests, as we discussed and as we will discuss some more. So they're punctuated by some of the macro failures, but not without significant and extremely important advancements on the strategic and mobilizationary levels, as well as on the levels of awareness. Many would also add the psychological advances made vis-a-vis breaking the wall of fear and so on. Given my colleagues have shared this critique in actually in some detail in the first panel, I will skip some of these comments and I'll say more potentially about that after addressing some of the framing issues I'm trying to focus on here. And I know that I have a limited time, so I'll be quick. With few minutes, within the few minutes, I'd like to offer some comments on the question of framing. A first step is to in my view, is to disaggregate the notion of the Middle East or even the Arab world, as we often speak of the uprisings across the region in monolithic terms. This is itself an intellectual can of worms that requires its own series of panels and discussion. More practically, I have been advocating since the eruption of the term Arab uprisings that this is not one event as so many address it, which is the original sin that produced the term Arab Spring. I am not a fan of the term, as I shared. In other words, as we consider the past 10 years closely, we would be much better off analytically as well as politically at some level if we disaggregate the term. The Arab uprisings is not one event, but a series of events with different conditions, dynamics, cadence, space, relations, institutions, endowments, not to mention societal differences regarding relative homogeneity, heterogeneity, distribution, and so on. Instead, beyond the enduring cultural commonalities which do exist and helped shape the demonstration or domino effect, I see research, writing, I see research, sorry, I see observe as in I observe and witness, I research and write and teach the Arab uprisings as a set of 6 or 10 separate cases or more. True, there are commonalities, as I suggested, and common denominators, but these don't help us understand the different trajectories we observed. To develop a deeper understanding of the uprisings as researchers, educators, people interested in the region, we must look at the individual cases on a case-by-case basis, even if we do this without jettisoning the region or the notion of the Arab world or the weight and gravity of external intervention. The most productive unit of analysis in the case is the case itself and its trajectories and relations. True, there are some commonalities as I shared, but we do need to go beyond that. The trajectory of each case reflects the interaction and synergy among a host of factors, and just as important is the task of distinguishing between various subregions within a particular case, various locales and ways of life within a case study. Rural and urban, for instance, city and countryside, small towns versus metropolitan cities with all their corollaries. These gradations and layers help us understand starting points and breaking points, endurance and thresholds, the capacity to withstand hardship versus fragility and readiness to revolt, which explain quite a bit or help us understand quite a bit of the differences across cases. If we want to understand, therefore, the
Listen, we're at
uprisings
the
in their
1 minute
ongoing,
mark.
that's 1 minute, right? Thank you. Shukran. If we want to understand the uprisings in their totality, in their ongoing living moment, which is something we are experiencing today and we will continue to experience, we have to go back and forth from the macro to the micro within each case as well. Finally, but by no means a residual point is the dead horse many of us keep beating, and frankly, the impetus for putting together this project. As much as we think we understand the multitude of factors within a particular moment in history, we would still be lacking perspective if we don't see the present as the future of past trajectories. Observing and analyzing the longue durée offers this perspective. It's the difference between understanding why something in particular transpired as opposed to what governs, or more modestly, what shapes its occurrence and recurrence. The seeds of slow-moving and seemingly invisible factors are always already planted beforehand. They become visible when we both zoom out in time and space and apply our analytical tools and categories to decipher them. I'll stop here, and I'm not going to get a chance to talk about the individual cases.
Thank you so much, Bassam. That was great. And now I'm going to turn it over to Sherene Seikaly. Sherene, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you, Bassam and Amaney, for bringing us together. It's hard to believe that 10 years have passed since Egyptians took to the streets to wage a battle for the present and the future. We are still entrenched in this battle, although we seem to be losing, as we face the formidable forces of entrenched and victorious counter-revolution, a once-in-a-century pandemic, intensified climate crisis, and the global resurgence of the right. It is this dyad of defeat and an ongoing, albeit depleted struggle that renders commemoration a problem. Commemoration suggests that the story is over, that we are ready to parse through what we want to remember and what we want to forget, and seal these events and phenomena in a book, a service, an archive, a separate physical or online space. But in many ways, the latest surge of Sudanese, Iraqi, Lebanese, and Algerian peoples demanding once again bread, freedom, and social justice hints that we're not yet ready to commemorate, And even though each of these struggles are distinct and specific to their conditions, the lessons they offer for theory and practice are continuous with the last decade of uprisings. So here I'm just going to share a story that has been very moving to me, and it's the story of Awadiya Mahmoud Koko, who in the scorching last week of May 2019 ran a street kitchen just off of Gumhuriya Avenue, where demonstrators conducted a resilient sit-in in front of Sudan's military headquarters in Khartoum. She fed the fasting demonstrators she called lions. Some called her the mother of the revolution. Others knew her as the mother of Kandaka, the Nubian princess who Sudanese women resurrected as a model of leadership in their bid for a different future. Koko was born in the Nuba Mountains of South Kordofan. Fleeing civil war in the 1950s, her family found refuge in Khartoum. After she married, Koko set up a tea stall. She hoped to provide for her family. Like many vendors in Sudan and beyond, she was subject to the police's random yet orchestrated acts of public humiliation. Koko, as was the case for her compatriots from South Kordofan, bore the brunt of institutionalized anti-Blackness. Fined time and again, never managing to make ends meet, she confronted one of the regime's longest tentacles, Article 243, a law that reflected an abiding hatred for the poor. The regime used Article 243 to imprison Koko and countless women like her for indebtedness. Koko's itinerary and incarceration lasted for 4 years. Prison, as journalist Ariane Lavrieux from Meda Masr notes, did not deter Koko. Her release marked a lifetime of mobilizing. In 1990, she established a women's tea sellers cooperative. 2 decades later, she was the president of the Multi-Purpose Cooperative Union for Women in Khartoum. Koko imparts lessons in sustenance. She didn't simply feed the bravery of the demonstrators. She fed something else that happens in uprisings: experiments with togetherness, a co-living that interrupts routinized experiences of time and space. Together, Koko and her lions crafted a public intimacy, an invigorating interruption of the present. This togetherness is ephemeral. It can turn ugly. In its temporary and contingent beauty, it threatens the status quo. In Khartoum, the experiment inspired the brutality of the Janjaweed forces, the military men who cut their teeth implementing Omar Bashir's genocidal imperatives in Darfur. The peaceful experiment shattered. The Janjaweed murdered hundreds of Koko's lions. Their corpses sank in the waters of the Nile. But in crafting a public home just off of Gumhuriya Avenue, Koko's corporal labor reveals that what makes rebellion possible, in this case food, is also what the rebels are demanding. For me, one of the most enduring and ongoing legacies of the uprisings is how can we understand the body, the gendered, raced, classed, sexed, the body with disabilities as a site of both resistance and oppression? And how can such a methodological attention allow us to transcend the speaking silent dyad as the only way to access subjugated voices and subjugated knowledge? Revolutionary bodies and their labor invite us to decenter the state, to decenter empire as the only objects of our analysis. They invite us to move from the perspective of the drone looking down with an all-knowing force to the perspective of the body, a perspective that allows us to look from the inside out. This corporal perspective can help us to understand that the body itself is not a predetermined vessel, but a historical subject that is organic, autonomous, and constantly changing. I've only spoken of one case here, but there are so many more. Vendors, protesters, people with disabilities, those everyday people who make everyday choices, the heroes and the anti-heroes, who teach us about the malleable walls of bureaucracy that confine and limit possibility and potential. They show us how states recruit everyday people to perform daily acts of deprivation and humiliation. Those rebels, those journalists, those scholars, those countless people who teach us that the repetitive strain of humiliation is a form of slow and debilitating death. These revolutionaries also teach us that one form of freedom is freedom from that repetitive strain. They refuse the choice between a quick death and a slow death. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sherene. That was absolutely wonderful, and the time was spot on, so really appreciate that. So we're going to turn to our next presenter, Rabab Al-Mahdi. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Amaney and Bassam, for bringing us together. I want to start my my brief comments with building on what Bassam and Sherene said. So while I agree with Bassam that there is a much needed focus and missing focus on disaggregating the story, Sherene very nicely told a story, just reinforced my disagreement with Bassam about the importance to look for commonality. And while I don't think that they're mutually exclusive, I think by disaggregating, we also need to be trying to gauge what's common, not only within the stories of the Arab uprisings, but also the story of contention and politics of contention in this global historical moment across the world. The story Sherene just told is when she was reciting it, I could see the same image from streets and women of Cairo in 2011 all the way until 2013. And I'm sure if we change the names and the details of what's being sold, it would be a story that resonates with people from Black Lives Matter to the streets of Lima. And this is why I think gauging commonalities and trying to look at commonalities is very important when we're marking the 10 years of the Arab uprisings. Again, usually the question here and in similar, not in this panel, but the question at this time would be for many, why did the Arab uprisings fail? And I think this is a very limiting question. And I think a more important question would be to look at the developments that happened worldwide during the past 10 years. Everything from the rise of populist movement throughout the world, all the way to the storming that happened in DC this month, which again reminded me of scenes that I've seen in Peru, in Cairo during Ittihadiyya time. So I think the more appropriate question would be, what does the current historical moment bring to us in terms of limitations and opportunities? And how can we see the Arab uprisings 10 years later as part of a broader movement for change with all the challenges that it faced, both north and south? I think in that regard, there are 4 comments that I would like to shed light on. And I think they are related both to the politics of the uprising and the knowledge production. And I hope that this project that we're part of would work on shedding light on some of those questions and issues over the coming year, as much as others would be doing. So I think one of the main pointers that come out from looking at the Arab uprisings in that context that I'm suggesting is that we see blurred lines between the functioning of the so-called democracies, democratized countries, and the authoritarian ones. So again, excuse me if my comments are also speaking to the limitations of the discipline that I come from, which others might not suffer, but it's something that I think about a lot. So when I look at the workings of regimes as different as, you know, Sisi in Egypt, you know, Trump in the US, Modi in India, I think that those categories that, you know, we held for such a long time between established democracies, democratizing subset, and, you know, semi-authoritarian, are not valid categories that would be helpful moving forward from where we are and what we know 10 years after the uprisings. Again, I remember 4 years ago, I was in New York, and you know, my bad luck, I came out on Fifth Avenue, and it was Trump's birthday, and a group of his supporters were celebrating his birthday, and another group on the other side of Fifth Avenue were demonstrating against them, and it was so similar to what I've seen in front of Niqabat al-Sahafiyin in Cairo, the same altercations, the same, even the language, you know, the whole Prozac nation as opposed to Tramadol nation in Egypt, you know, such similarities that I think should push us into examining the working of political systems and the rise of authoritarianism without, you know, getting straitjacketed by those limitations that we know in the discipline. In that sense, I think politically, we also need to be looking at the limitations of democracy as it is and as we know it. For the longest time, you know, we've thought of, or many of us thought of, the uprisings or read the uprisings as a push towards democratization. You know, there's democratization through, you know, reform, and there's, you know, from within the system, and there are the uprisings and whatnot. And this has been emphasized and overemphasized. And I think part of the limitations is that has to do with structurally with the system of modern democracy, both presidential and parliamentarian, as we know it now. And I think this, both in terms of knowledge production and in terms of materializing in itself in praxis and for a political project, would be something that we need to reconsider. What is wrong with the workings of those systems that shouldn't make them necessarily, you know, the ultimate go for thing that we're looking at. The second issue, again, that I would think is worth noting is that we see the Arab uprisings were not an anomaly globally. They were dialectically related. They were fed and changed with, you know, and helped change other movements that came before them, both within the region and outside the region. I cannot think of the Arab uprisings away from the Occupy movement. I cannot think of both away from Podemos, mass movements in Latin America. So I think there is a common thread here that has to do with contentious politics and how they are manifesting itself in the 21st century. And in that sense, there's the commonality of, you know, the sense of togetherness. I remember, you know, when there was the Occupy movement in New York, and we had decided from Cairo that, you know, we need to send pizza. And there's that sense of solidarity, but there's also a change, an exchange of tactics and what we do and what not to do, so on and so forth. But there's also a shared limitation. And I think we need to be clear that, you know, all those movements have not achieved what they originally came out thinking they could achieve, at least during the, you know, short term. So I think in thinking of the richness of the movement, we need to also calibrate the the shortcomings in terms of organization and in terms of outcome.
Rabab, I think you
okay. So I will limit myself. I had two comments, but I will actually, basically very shortly. One has to do with the definition of what we think of as change, and that parochial. I think we've been over-focused when looking at those movements at a particular set of changes having to do with regime changes. And we tend to dismiss all those manifestations societally having to do with changing in gender dynamics that I see in a place like Egypt, changes on the within the art scene, so on and so forth. And I think we need to take account of this. The final thing, I think it's a moment, there's that commonality of unprecedented inequality worldwide. And I'm not talking about economic crises. I'm not talking about, GDPs and whatnot, but rising inequalities even when economies are doing well. And I think that this is another common thread that we see across the world, and that cannot be disaggregated or not looked at when we're discussing the uprisings and all forms of contentious movements. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Rabab, for those wonderful, excellent, insightful comments. Terrific. Next on our list is Muriam Haleh-Davis. Is it Haleh or
It's Haleh.
Haleh, I thought so. Sorry, after I said
That's
it.
Okay.
So I apologize. Welcome, Maryam. The floor is yours.
Thank you to Amaney and Bassam for helping put this together. It's really an honor. And I have to say that I've put my own prepared comments by the wayside in listening to my colleagues over these two panels. And I really appreciate being part of a group of scholars and comrades for whom the notion that failure is not the optic that we should use is more or less a given. I don't think that any of us here would use that in our own writing and thinking. And it also begs the question about what do social movements do? They don't succeed or fail. They create, they engender, they co-opt. And co-option, I think, needs to be part of our conversation in terms of how these social movements evolve. Thinking about this panel, my specialty is Algeria. And so there is very much an ongoing revolutionary process in Algeria. And Algeria offers that as a challenge. The 2-year anniversary of the Hirak will be happening later in February. But Algeria also offers not only a decentered geographical and historical perspective, but also a different temporality for thinking about revolution. Protesters took to the streets twice a week for over a year before protests stopped, right? So this was a totally different kind of effective notion of revolution than, being in the square as many people have come to theorize space and bodies. And so to go back to Sherene's point about, the repetition of bodies and the repetition of protest and the narrative over time of telling one's own story rather than it being told. And that's something I've heard from talking to friends and activists quite a bit. And so I also would just like to say with a lot of humility that I'm always a bit uncomfortable accepting these kinds of invitations as much as I learn from them because I have not been an actor on the ground. And so with a lot of humility and appreciation for my Algerian comrades who have been so brave and so patient and so tenacious over the past few years. And so, thinking about this from the Maghreb in general and knowledge production brings up the question of how does the Maghreb fit into the Middle East and indeed into the Arab world. The notion that this is the Arab world is of course very contentious, seen from North Africa, where, for a long time, one of the slogans of the Kabyle Spring was corriger l'histoire, l'Algérie n'est pas arabe, right? This was their response to the hegemonic project not only of Pan-Arabism, but to the Algerian state insistence on this Jacobin unitary identity linguistically, ethnically, and religiously. And at the same time as we have that uncomfort, we have the central place of Algeria in thinking about decolonization and revolution, right? Theorists like Frantz Fanon, many of us read Sartre's essays on colonialism. This theoretical and intellectual universe is indeed one of the central spaces of making meaning of revolution. And so this is another tension, I think, that arises in studying knowledge production about the quote unquote uprisings from North Africa. And one thing that has also come to mind, I have not kept track of time, so please don't hesitate to cut me off, is the question of Palestine. And of course, historically, when one thinks about settler colonialism, Palestine looms large. In the Algerian imagination, there were many Palestinian flags on the streets during the Hirak. But at the same time, even though absolutely Palestine is part of the kind of beating political heart of Algeria, I did hear, friends saying, well, there's so much social media coverage about these Palestinian flags. Is this going to become about Palestine again, right? Can we make this about Algeria and the Sudan perhaps, and maybe, Morocco? And that, other than one or two public commentators who came out and publicly kind of said, we need to get over Palestine, this was not said in the vein of, we need to get over Palestine, but rather, how can we share this discussion about settler colonialism and its effects with Palestine? And so, this question of decolonization looms really large, at least in the Algerian case, where questions of history and the need to reappropriate historical figures, to have a vocabulary to tell the state that they don't get to determine who the heroes of the revolution were, even as they've used the revolution to enhance their own political legitimacy. And so, the conundrum is, how do you tell the state that they don't get to be the owners of the revolution and that legitimacy without undermining what that revolution meant? And how do you combat a kind of bureaucratization of this history? So, to go back to this question of 2011, I was in Algiers when some of these uprisings were happening, and I got a lot of calls and requests to write things about the Arab Spring, quote unquote, which we all know the problems with that term, but also the Algerian and Maghrebi exception, right? Why wasn't Algeria having the same kind of revolutionary process? And I'll just say two things about that. The first is, those observers weren't paying very close attention. There were actually hundreds of riots, which is one means of political protest that indeed we need to take seriously. And again, enlarging our imagination about what does protest look like. They were local events. They often had a specific concern. They were not led by a political party. They were often quite careful not to make demands that sounded overtly political. But of course, the price of bread, schooling conditions, housing access, these things are all by nature political. And so there was a quite impressive deployment of police forces that started cutting off the capital and public spaces. We've seen this repertoire come back again. So on the one hand, there was the fact that indeed there was quite a lot happening on the ground. But on the other hand, there was this notion that Algeria had already had its Arab Spring, quote unquote. And that is to say that October 1988 and the massive protests that in the name of democracy led to a civil war has also been one of the founding historical touchstone. And so again, thinking about different temporalities of these revolutionary processes, in Algeria, it's the protests of October 1988 that kind of resonate the most. And in the spirit of making connections, one heard often both about Morocco and Algeria that the youth were depoliticized, that they didn't follow politics, that really what they were interested in were selling cigarettes on street corners. And I don't mean just the kind of Orientalist Western discourse. This was a discourse that could also be found by politicians who portrayed their populations in childlike terms that were to be spoken down to and were not to be taken seriously. And perhaps lastly, I'm surely running out of time, the temporality of Bouteflika's own health is something that also changed how people thought about the Fifth Mandate, which was the sparking episode for all of this. And so when one thinks about the new geographical orientations of these uprisings in terms of Morocco, Algeria, and the Sudan in particular, of course, also Lebanon and Iraq, but to kind of stay on the African continent, I think it does help us see some of the things we took for granted in thinking about the quote unquote Arab world, and the desire of the Algerian regime to say, to commemorate an ongoing revolutionary process. So I'll stop there, but thank you again for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Maryam. That was excellent. And you came in about 30 seconds right before your time expired. So I appreciate that and great insights on Algeria. Moving next to our colleague, Nadje Al-Ali. Nadje, the floor is yours. Amr Adly is next, but we are having some technical difficulties. So we're going to turn it to you, Nadje, if that's okay.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. So much of what I was going to say has been said by colleagues. So I want to reflect on that. So one of the sort of strands that I feel we've touched upon in sort of different contexts is the tension or balancing act between when we look at temporality on the one hand, the kind of snapshot approach as opposed to the longue durée approach, or when we speak about disaggregation versus commonality, as Rabab pointed out. So these are tensions, but I would also agree with Rabab and others that it's not an either or. And so that's why, precisely because of that reason, I think it's so important that we are collectively looking at this, because clearly it is important to have different disciplinary perspectives as well as theoretical and epistemological perspectives. And I think I very much would make the case that it can't be an either or, but it's a constant tension and balancing act between stressing the longue durée, the historical context, the way that social movements, protest, resistance, have a long precedent, but at the same time, trying to zoom into the specificities, and the same in terms of, what makes these various protest movements unique in the context of the region. And here I also want to express my discomfort with the idea of Arab protest, Arab uprisings. And for me, there are various reasons. On one level, I find, like Bassam, I think that the term glosses over different kinds of protests and uprisings with different historical trajectories. So I think that's problematic. But also, as Asli in the previous panel pointed out, I think the term Arab prevents us from looking comparatively at processes in the region, such as the Green Movement in Iran in 2009, or the Gezi protests in Turkey in 2013. So I think that's really very significant. But then I guess for me, most significantly, as someone who has worked for quite a while on the Kurdish movement, I mean, in 2011 was in Iraq when, the widest uprisings were actually north of Iraq in the Kurdish region. And the Kurdish activists I talked to were not very impressed with the terminology of Arab Spring and felt quite excluded. And I think if we really take seriously the way that different power configurations intersect, and certainly as a feminist scholar, I'm very conscious of the way that patriarchy intersects with other power configurations. I think it's about time that we need to take Arab hegemony and the way it's constructed seriously, and consider the fact that ethnic minorities, ethnic and religious minorities are marginalized and discriminated, not only in terms of policy, but also in terms of narrative. And I think we've been complicit in this. And I think it's time. And I understand, of course, that there is a sort of resistance to Western hegemony, and Arab has, of course, an important political history of resistance. But I think it's time to rethink that. And I very much agree with Rabab that it's time to rethink our categories in general, because like her, what I see happening everywhere, and I, should say I sort of recently moved to the US from the UK, and I'm in Germany a lot, and obviously sort of also follow what's happening in various countries in the Middle East. I mean, what I see happening is this polarization, precisely as Rabab was describing, where you have a growth of authoritarian, fascist, racist movements across the world. So I think we really need to rethink. But again, I think there is this balancing act in terms of, so what are some of the commonalities in this current historical moment, the politics of contestation as Rabab described it, and what are the specificities of what we've seen unfolding over the past 10 years. Now, I mentioned that, for me, as a feminist scholar, I would also, similar to what Lina Abu Habib was saying in the first panel, but also Sherene alluded to it, the significance of gender and body politics. I think that's really a big shift. In the past, I've always or often have been part of panels, I mean, Mesa, lots of times where we would have all the big events like social change, war, conflict. We often have all male panels discussing the big issues. And then we have the ladies panels, where we would discuss the gender issues. And, all of us who were doing the gender issues would go to listen to our male colleagues and would then interject and would point out, that maybe a gendered analysis might add to their discussion of the wider issues. They would never come to our panels. And I think there's a change. I think there is a recognition that gender and body politics are not marginal to wider political processes, but are central to understandings of resistance, of authoritarianism, sectarianism, you name it. And this is a recognition, I think, that is shared by many actors on the ground. I mean, one of the hopeful parts of what we've seen unfolding is that more and more men, especially young men, recognize that their vision for an alternative future, a future that's more equal, I share sort of limitations about democracy, but more egalitarian, that gender-based rights and the struggle against gender-based violence has to be central to that struggle. And so while we do see what my colleague and friend Denise Candiotti described as masculinist restoration, we do see patriarchal authoritarian regimes, but also militia, non-state actors violently trying to crush gender-based equality. And so what she calls masculinist restoration. So patriarchy as usual does not exist, is not able to sustain itself. So there's like a very strong backlash against any forms of sort of gender-based claims. But while this is happening, and the articulation of that is often increased in sexual violence, harassment, and so on, we do see that more and more men are actively opposed to that as well. So I think it's really important. And so finally, I'd also like to make a point, and this was mentioned in the first panel by Ziad Abou-Riche already, sort of the question of solidarity. For those of us based in Europe, in North America, or in other countries in the region or elsewhere outside of the Middle East, how do we express our solidarity? And I think that we have to think more carefully about positionality without falling into the trap of straitjacket of identity politics and the reifying of authentic positions versus external positions. And I think I'm quite conscious of that, especially having moved to the States, where I feel, there are, given the politics of the US, I think, you know, as a scholar or as an activist, and both, of course, there is the strong push to resist US policy, but I think that sometimes happens at the risk of overemphasizing US imperialism and not paying attention to regional and local factors. That certainly in the context of gender politics is a big problem. So we can't, don't get me wrong, I mean, you know, I've worked on the occupation of Iraq, so I mean, I know the impact of imperialism on the region, but you know, that is not the only lens through which we need to understand political processes, and that's also not the only thing that people are resisting against. But everyone here knows that. But I think that sometimes that is a tension, and of course that has been a tension in terms of Western-based academics and then activists in the region who sometimes feel undermined by our work and what we're saying. And I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadje. And that's a really good point in terms of thinking how we interface with activists and how we might be shaping debates in our own work. So that's really excellent intervention on your part. Really appreciate it. We're going to move now to Lisa Wedeen. Lisa, the floor is yours. And looking forward to what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Amaney, and thank you, Bassam and MK, for organizing this wonderful set of panels. If to commemorate is a call to remembrance, and these panels are the beginning of what colleagues and I hope will be a series of reflections, opportunities to take stock of the last 10 years, consider the ongoingness of struggle, and to think together about the power and limitations of scholarship on the uprising. Marking the uprisings is an invitation to reflect the expressions of optimism that are no longer doing a work, and the forms of pessimism that are an alibi for resignation. It's also a call to unsettle conventional modalities of knowledge production, as many people have underscored here. For many, it may also be a time of mourning for loved ones lost and the political aspirations, at least at the time of this panel, muffled or mangled by authoritarian retrenchments, physical displacement, depression, rage, and in the context of Tunisia, by the disappointments of a democracy still elusive and embedded in the predatory and exploited mechanisms of global capital. As Malcolm Bradbury's novel, Dr. Criminal, highlights in relation to a previous era of disenchantment after the so-called Velvet Revolutions, another problematic term in Eastern Europe, the 1990s, quote, "Democracy, the free market, do you really think that can save us? It promises hope and it gives you Kentucky Fried Chicken." In this critical view of the building process, there's no justice without a commitment to undoing capitalism's forms of control, including but not reduced to imperial control. I take Nadje's point here. And Tunisia's current protests arguably index that critique in placards that say colonial or, quote, "employment is a right, not a," or in homage to Victor Hugo's statements to the 1851 National Assembly, "police everywhere, justice nowhere," and a shout out to Larissa Chomiak for helping me with some of these slogans. Young people in particular are registering their anger at broken promises, perceived corruption, hypocrisy, and incompetencies of the current government in Tunisia, which in the context COVID lockdowns in a global system reliant on indebtedness is on the precipice of bankruptcy. Work in my discipline of political science, as Rabab has also pointed out, has been overly celebratory of democracy building in Tunisia, or has fetishized the box, or that Tunisia as a remarkable exception to the other countries included in the so-called Arab Spring, again, a horrible term. These things need to be rethought, both in terms of Tunisians' profound disaffection with democracy building and in terms of the existence of democratic practice and elsewhere. There's a temporal short-sightedness, as many people have pointed out on these panels, to which I will return. So young people more generally in the Middle East and North Africa are eager for lives that are more affirming and just than this current offer. And these desires for a better life are inflected by class distinctions, but cannot be reduced to them. Using the networking and communicative capacities of social media, as well as traditional strategies of street protests, Tunisians, Algerians, Lebanese, Iraqis, and Sudanese, to take 5 recent examples showcased here, have protested the raw political deals they've been dealt. They've been both inspired by, but also learned from the challenges of the revolutions of 2010-11. Aspects of the 2010-11 uprisings that I find most promising for the present are questions associated then with protest legacy. How have the revolutions of 10 years ago helped generate current strategies for activism in 2021? What modes of adaptation and invention are being employed? What have ordinary citizens, revolutionaries learned in the interim, and how are they making use of that knowledge, if they are, in 2021? And what of youth who barely remember 2011? What are the generational gaps, the conflicts, perspectives, memory practices, lacunae, and transnational conversations led to this moment? The revolutions of 2011 let a big out of the bottle, as a cartoon from Kafranbel, Syria, playfully noted early on. And even though people, especially in countries that have experienced major crackdowns or civil war, are beyond exhausted, that genie isn't going back in the bottle anytime soon. A second set of questions that come to mind marked by the are, what kinds of artistic production and forms of creative virtuosity, often produced in exile, what kinds of toxic conversations, modes of exclusion and ressentiment are also characteristic of the more siloed publics in this fragmented national imaginary? What do all of the luminous and the dark aspects of current expression tell us about people's commitments to the countries they've left? Nation form as a particular of collective imagining. How have Middle Eastern film directors, poets, novelists, artists, playwrights, comedians, and scholars who participated in the creative output associated with the uprisings recalibrated their relation to revolution in the context of current setbacks, including the challenges posed by ongoing violence, geographic distance, and by COVID-19? How might feelings of disenchantment or deflation help in the recuperation of a creative wiseness to politics and empowering new social movements? Third, and finally, in a global era of climate disruption, ongoing militarism, radical inequality, and multimodal disinformation campaigns, what are the analytic tools needed to sort through all the claims and counterclaims, the lies and uncertainties, the manipulations and premonitions rising the contemporary period? And this is a question that the anthropologist Joe Masco and I ask in a new book. And in light of such mounting epistemological challenges, how are people's survival strategies, political projects, and concepts of the future to be treated methodologically? What are the links between analysis and social movements, and what are the lived consequences of epistemic confusion in terms of both affects and political imagination? So I want to conclude with 2 points, lessons that from Syrian interlocutors, often in their capacity as political theorists, artists, activists, friends, and comrades. First point, scholars, in an effort to both decolonize knowledge and avoid romanticizing resistance, might want to think with renewed vigor about the dynamics of political reproduction, of the ways in which authoritarianism, empire, liberalism, racism, patriarchy, you name it, remain agile and resilient, capable of absorbing critiques and producing new forms of buy-in. Yet while it's true that much of the important transgressive agentive work may not be politically transformative in the short run, and while it may even reproduce the very conditions of oppression being disavowed, protests, cultural production, scholarly, and other world-making activities are where political vitality tends to reside, registering how we cope, and stretch genres in meaningful ways. Or to put this differently, rather than overemphasize agent or structure, we need to dialectically about structure and agency, taking into account the important forms of irreverence, social movement activism, and alternative world-making practices that have liberatory potential, while also analyzing the daunting challenges to effecting social and political change. Second and finally, in light of what history has taught us, it's too early to think of the Arab revolutions of 2011 as over or failed. And this has been a recurrent theme in both the earlier panel and in this one as well. The revolution took 100 years. If commentators in that era were asked to discuss the revolution of 1789 and 1799, or the one of 1848 in 1858, they would have had a radically different analysis than the ones that scholars of the French Revolution can write now, with the advantage of a longer durée perspective. Than sounding knells prematurely, it behoves us to stay both grounded and theoretically minded, humble and curious, for it's too soon to know what the future will tell us about a recent past, soon to be past present, as Bassam Haddad pointed out. To cite a current Tunisian slogan, La révolution est toujours en route. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for that excellent presentation. Really thought-provoking. Now we're going to turn it over to Mohammed. Mohammed, the floor is yours.
First, thank you, Amaney and Bassam, for this wonderful opportunity to share our thoughts about the events 10 years later. What I would like to say resonates very much with a lot of my colleagues have said, especially Rabab, whose notes I appreciate very much. I have 10 minutes, I think, and I have 10 theses about revolution. So 1 minute each, basically. First is that the most common fact about, I think, all revolutions in world history is that they are surprising, and that no revolution has ever, in fact, been predicted. We're not unique here. To the contrary, revolutions seem to happen in spite of the science that from today's perspective, from the current perspectives that say that they do not have the resources that will allow them to happen. And I'll just mention the prototypical example for me before the 2011 uprising is the first Palestinian Intifada in 1987, which actually does have many of the same features of what happened in 2011, although we tend to have forgotten about it now, but basically it's sociologically speaking, it did have several organizational features, as well as it happened at a time when it was when the Palestinian struggle seemed to have been at a very low point in terms of resources available to it. Second, revolutions, as many of my colleagues have mentioned, are long-term cultural processes. They are not events. And that for me, the last thing that revolutions change is the political system. The first thing they change is the culture. And that point, I think there's a lot to talk about when we come to that point. Third, revolutions are primarily educational experiences. But as we know, not all students learn the same lesson just because they happen to be in the same class. Fourth, we tend to forget revolutions immediately in the aftermath. That is when realpolitik sets in and the social dynamics that have brought about the revolutionary explosion are forgone. I mean, the social psychological kind of factors, the social psychology that is revealed in the revolutionary moment, it seems to me has little to do with the deliberative rationality of the post-revolutionary period, which has its own kind of dynamics that we tend to focus on a lot, I think, more than the revolutionary itself. Fifth, eventually the activists themselves forget the revolution as well, primarily because they are told everywhere by everyone, by academics, by funding agencies, by political parties, that what matters is where the revolutions lead, not how they have happened. The dynamics associated with the revolutionary moments are not the known conditions, sadly, like poverty, inequality, repression, and so on. Although these are important, but those factors have always been there, and there's nothing really new about them. What is new in the revolutionary experience, I think itself, and those of us who have the fortune of directly participating in them is their spiritual quality. That is, they seem to be, for their participant, to be comparable to a prophetic revelation, sudden vision, like in the Quran hadith, the idea of the falaq al-subh as kind of really the way by which kind of a new kind of reality, a new vision of the world was all of a sudden makes its appearance, not through kind of the exploration of the thesis about revolution. The seventh thesis that the 2011 and the 2019 waves seem still to show repeatable general patterns in terms of their social psychology in particular, not necessarily the politics they are confronting, but kind of the importance of trans-local identity as opposed to sectarian or local kind of identity. The idea of society, so to speak, becomes visible to the person as a result. The role of the marginal areas in each locality in kind of spearheading at least the most contentious early kind of theaters of the revolution. Spontaneity as an art of movement, a feeling of the little person that she or he is the maker of history as opposed to the savior leader. Notion of citizenship as responsibility for society and not simply as belonging to it. And of course, the regime response in all cases, which is kind of a lack of understanding of what is happening, so to speak. And these are factors that we see in 2011, also 2019, again, which seems to kind of suggest that there's a pattern kind of in the social ecology that will tend to repeat itself. And there is kind of historical transformation because these patterns are not similar to how earlier revolutions has happened in the same region. The eighth point is that, and this has been mentioned as well a couple of times, especially by Rabab, that the question of revolutionary waves as a global kind of event, not everywhere, but beyond a certain region, and the importance of trying to see how revolutionaries kind of in various locations kind of learn from each other. And again, that's not the first thing that has happened. But also, we need also to appreciate how counter-revolution is also a global trend, to speak as well, just as the revolution itself. As we look though at those comparisons and this globality of waves, one thing I think we need to be very aware of and very sensitive to is what I call epistemological imperialism, namely the kind of the tendency to universalize from a local experience. And that I see actually right now in this year, and especially those who work in American academic environment, the tendency to universalize American race problematics, even American race categories, rather than thinking more generally about the techniques of exclusion and how they are related to kind of revolutionary waves. Ninth, I think if we pay attention to everything that has been mentioned before, we can come up with a science of revolutions, not a science that predicts revolutions, because I do not think we can predict them. If we can predict them, they will never happen. They will be arrested by a regime that have learned how to predict them. But each revolution, I think, brings with it the kind of knowledge that is of a new type that we can learn from, and that knowledge is important and new, precisely because we were not able to predict evolution before. So it is not a shortcoming that we did not predict things. In fact, that's an invitation for us to learn from the revolution that's bringing its own science with it as it happens. And finally, I think we need this kind of science, again, in order to be able to predict how emancipation will exactly happen, because I don't think any of us knows how it is going to happen, the emancipation that is, although we have all our wishes about what we would like to see in terms of that. The more importantly, I think that we need this learning from the dynamics of the revolutionary moment itself and how it happens, is how to see a reality beyond the reality that we see, how to see the revolutionary person hiding inside the conformist traditional person that we see in front of us. Because if we do not see that other hidden person, we are never going to see a revolution. And I think I'm going to stop here at this tempo. I assume that I'm out of time, maybe.
Thank you, Mohammed. That's like perfect timing. And thank you for your very wonderful points and interventions into this debate. It's been very nice since I know a lot of people have been referencing one another. We still have 10 minutes before the program officially ends. And I'd like to use this opportunity to see if anybody would like to engage another person's point or ask a question of one of the other panelists. I think Bassam had his hand up, so I'm going to turn it to Bassam, but anybody else also just let me know or step in.
Well, first, thanks to everyone. We are delighted that this 16-person panel or two panels went without a hitch. We will actually be publishing this on different platforms, including YouTube for those who do not have Facebook, as well as on Jadaliyya and potentially on the unit or the organization's websites that are co-sponsors. So I will stop with that because I hope others can opine. There's one quick comment I'd like to make, and about the question of aggregation and disaggregating the term uprisings. And though it would be a good debate to have it if I actually said it, but I actually didn't because I was reading from my text. Just to clarify, I advocate not having a blanket statement that applies to all cases. And the idea is to understand different trajectories. If we would like to understand what happened within those cases, is to look at the cases as independent cases, as they connect to the region or not, but to look at the cases and not have blanket statements regarding the Arab uprisings as the unit of analysis, which is, by the way, one of the ways so many commentators have been able to dismiss the Arab uprisings as a failed set of events, or as a failed event, even like a singular event. So even though it's a really good, important point, and maybe others can have that statement or argument that we shouldn't look at commonalities. Indeed, the most important point, which I started with, is that these commonalities are crucial and they're important in explaining the sort of domino effect or the demonstration effect and beyond, actually. But to understand the difference in development within these cases, we must look at the cases. So in case I wasn't clear, I'm just making a clarification. Other than that, I think we do have a few minutes, and it's really up to you, to everyone here, to stay on, because we don't have a panel after, but I'm assuming that everyone is tired. So Amaney, shall we set a time, like maybe 10 minutes or 10 to 15 minutes?
I think we can finish at 4 o'clock. It's 3:53. I know Nadje has something. I think it's late where she is. So, but if anybody wants to chime in or address Bassam's point, please, by all means, we have some time. Otherwise, we'll end a little bit early. Going once. Twice. So I guess on that note, so I think you know that we've you know, hopefully everybody will have an opportunity to watch both installments of these episodes and your participation. There are a lot of like novel ideas and important correctives on the table as we think about the Arab uprisings, and I'm especially I'm especially encouraged by the discussion that really brought a lot of nuance from the ground, perspectives from the ground, for us to think about as we move forward. But nevertheless, I think the big takeaway point is that this is still an ongoing historical process. And we're still trying to analyze and understand this historical process, not only in terms of thinking about it in comparative perspective, but also sort of appreciating the merits and the nuances of the case on its own, for us to better appreciate changes on the ground, dynamics, debates, and how citizens in the region are also framing the debate themselves. So with that, if anybody doesn't have any final words, I want to thank all of you for your commitment. I know we've met several times to get here. So again, the seminar are very indebted to your patience, time, effort. And this is a year-long project. So we will see many of you again. And we're looking forward to working with all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And look out for another panel next month on teaching the Arab uprisings, and in March on archives and the uprisings, and we will advertise those. Thanks all. Salam.